Continuing our reading in Abraham Hannibal and the Battle for the Throne by Francis Summers Cox. Today is Chapter 5, The Slave Market. At last the voyage ended, and they saw real daylight again. If Abraham had kept his counting stick with him, the marks would have shown day 49 since the shipwreck, and day 12 since he and Naganga were captured by the pirates on the Star of the Sea. They heard the capital of the Sultan's empire long before they saw it. For hours, as the sea grew narrower and busier, there was the shouting of distant sailors, the creaking of the rigging of other ships passing nearby, the plop of the oars of rowing boats. Then, as the Star of the Sea moored along some dockside, there was the crashing of cargoes being loaded and unloaded all around them. The braying of donkeys, the yelling of sailors and the porters and merchants and officials and street sellers. But they could hardly see anything through the portholes that they could make sense of. At last, half a dozen pirates came down into the hold with pistols in their hands and pushed them up the ladder one by one. They were greeted at the top by more pirates, who immediately tied their hands behind their backs. It was evening, but still the light made them all blink and squint and try to wipe their eyes. At last, Abraham started to see clearly. He saw that this was a city like no other, not even Cairo. High above him, past the dockside, rose great long hills where vast mansions with gigantic mosques with round domed roofs ranged from the water's edge up to the very top, seeming to float one above the other, and countless sharp tall towers pierced the sky. On the other side of a narrow inlet of sea were more hills, more huge buildings and towers, and beyond that a wider reach of water and more land again, far away. And as he looked, a cry rang out from every one of the tall towers, a cry he knew from Mecca and Cairo and the long days of trudging through the desert. Allah Akbar, God is great. The men on the dockside bowed down and said their evening prayers, and so did a few of the pirates, but most didn't bother. And soon Abraham, Naganga, and the Franks were being pushed down the gangplank and marched along steep and crowded alleyways up the hillside, until at last they came to a tall, wide stone building with huge wooden gates. They were led inside into an enormous courtyard. It was a bit like the merchants' inns and markets that Abraham kept having to go to in Cairo, running errands for Master Ahmet. A courtyard with a little mosque in the middle, and all around it a huge oblong of big open stalls on the ground floor, and 3 more floors above them, with a great long balcony running around each floor, overlooking the courtyard, and lots of little rooms opening off the balconies, all with strong wooden doors. In the merchants' inns in Cairo, the courtyards had been a hubbub of camels and donkeys and boxes and bundles of goods being loaded or unloaded, and the little rooms had been where the merchants slept and drank tea and stored their goods. But this market was different. Abraham stood and stared and stared. There they all were, men, women, and children, but especially women and children, tall and short, stocky and slim, their skins every shade, light brown, dark brown, white, deep blue-black, hair blonde and brown and red and black, long and straight, curly, frizzy, dark faces scarred with the scars of deepest Africa, round faces, long faces, thin faces, snub-nosed faces, and sharp-nosed faces. This was the most famous slave market of the East, the slave market of Istanbul. This was the home, for 1 day, or 2, or 20, until they were sold, of countless humans who would never see their real homes again. Elizabeth was the first to go. On the very first morning, the pirates had handed their whole batch of prisoners over to the local slave merchants, who were going to sell them off, and had gone back to their ship. The slave merchant took Elizabeth away and had her dressed up in fine robes of silk and velvet. They saw her as she was led off afterward to a separate pavilion at the far end of the courtyard where most of the white women and girls seemed to be put up for sale. And then again, as she was taken out of the market by a progression of fat old black men in magnificent robes and enormously tall hats. Mr. Robertson was standing with the others, the other Franks, and the children in a kind of raised pen. He had one arm around Andrew, the other around Abraham and Naganga, as if they could somehow stand in for Elizabeth. He murmured something in Andrew's ear in English, and then said in Arabic for the other two children, "Those are the Sultan's officials. I'll swear. It's just as I feared. She's gone to the Sultan's palace to join his slave girls." And Mr. Robertson began to shake with violent, silent sobs, and children hugged him and each other tighter and tighter, as if somehow they could squeeze the sobs into stopping. Andrew was bought that afternoon, picked by more government officials to become one of the Sultan's white slave guards. 2 days later, Mr. Robertson and most of the Franks from the Star of the Sea were bought as galley slaves. The same day, a wrinkled old man and his veiled wife came and looked at Naganga's ears and teeth and fingernails, and after a lot of arguing over the price, took her off to be trained as a cook. Abraham sat in a corner of the slave pen, feeling completely blank, empty, not even able to cry. "Goodbye. It's always goodbye. Goodbye to every friend I've ever had." That night, Abraham sat slumped on the cobbles of the courtyard, near some slave children talking and laughing around a fire. They were black like him and were chanting in broken Arabic. He could have joined in, but it all seemed too much effort. How could they laugh in this place? Suddenly, someone was speaking to him in a language he couldn't understand. He looked up. A little old white man, a Turk by his clothes, was looking down at him in quite a kindly way. "I don't understand you," muttered Abraham grumpily in Arabic. The old man switched over to Arabic. "Unhappiness will not help you, child. God has given us a hard life, and we must make the best of it. It's all very well for you to say that, but you're free. I'm a slave. I didn't ask to be here." "No, I am a slave too. I work here for the keeper of the slave market." In spite of himself, Abraham sat up straighter. "How did you come to be a slave?" The old man came and squatted down next to Abraham. "I was born in a cold land far to the north of here, in a country called Russia. Every year, wild horsemen come from the south and raid our villages, carrying off our most beautiful girls, our finest young boys, and bring them to this market for sale. The girls are taken into the palaces of the greatest lords, or even, if they are very lovely, into the palace of the Sultan himself, while the boys join the Sultan's army, or become page boys in his palace, or galley slaves in his ships." The old man shook his head sadly. "I was not a strong boy, or well made, but I was taken too, and bought by the keeper of the slave market to do cleaning here. I have known countless slaves come into this market and go out again, and I know that if they give up hope, they will soon sicken and die." "But most of the Frankish slaves seem to go on to lead a fine life in palaces," said Abraham. "What about us black ones? Why do we get all the hard work? What have we got to hope for in that sort of life?" "Even if you are sweeping the floor of your master's house, you are as much a child of God as he is, and you are worth every bit as much. Tell me, what is your name?" "Abraham." "Well, Abraham, did you ever hear of the story of Hannibal, the African?" Abraham shook his head. "Well, long ago, in faraway North Africa, there lived a boy named Hannibal. His father was king of that land, and for many years he waged war against a mighty empire, the most powerful that the world had ever known, the Empire of Rome. At last his father, the king, was about to die, and still he had not defeated the Roman enemy. And on his deathbed he made the boy Hannibal swear that he would never give up into the Empire of Rome. When Hannibal was a man, he ruled his father's kingdom. He waged war against the Roman enemy for year after year." Abraham was kneeling now, listening excitedly. Did Hannibal beat the Romans? Did he? Well, in the end, Hannibal decided that the only way to defeat the enemy was to attack its heart. He raised a great army of soldiers, horses, and even elephants, left Africa, and traveled for months after months, crossing great rivers and then terrible snow-covered mountains, where countless men and animals died of cold. At last he reached the Romans in their own land, but his forces were too small and too weak by now. They fought bravely time and time again, but in the end the Romans chased them away back home. "Oh no!" burst out Abraham. The little old Russian slave put his finger to his lips, smiling. Listen, Abraham, remember the promise that he has made to his father, that he would never give in to the Romans, so that rather than be ruled by them, he left his home to wander the earth, and in the end he settled near the place where we are now, until he heard that the Romans had found him out, and were following him even here. So rather than be captured by his old enemy, he took poison and died. But the story of Hannibal and his elephants and their march over the snowy mountains to attack Rome has never been forgotten. His grave is not far from here, and everyone knows it is Hannibal's grave. Think of it, Hannibal. Think of Hannibal, Abraham, and what he suffered, and how he didn't give in to the enemy. He was an African like you. Abraham's gloom had completely lifted. "When I was little, I had an adventure with some elephants," he exclaimed excitedly. "Well, you're not so very large now, but I think it's your turn to tell a story. What did you do with those elephants?" So Abraham told the old cleaner of the slave market the story of how a huge she-elephant, maddened by the pain of a spear wound in her face, had led her herd up from the wild lands of Ethiopia to his home town of Debarwa, and they had nearly ruined all their crops, but Abraham made them chase after him instead, so that the leader crashed down into a riverbed, and the herd had given up and blundered away again. Abraham was standing up by this time, jumping around as he acted out how he had yelled at the elephants and flapped his cloak and thrown stones at them, and how he had fallen over the riverbank himself. "And my father took me to visit the emperor in his palace as a reward. He even told the emperor the story of what I did, and it would never be forgotten, and that grandmothers would tell their grandchildren all about it at their firesides." Abraham stopped and suddenly realized that the little group of black slave children had left their fireside and were sitting listening to him wide-eyed. He grinned at them. "I'll bet you haven't got stories like that to tell." The children started laughing and cheering and talking all at once, and then they all settled down again around the fire and took it in turns to tell their own tales, while the old man swept the cobbles around them and smiled as he listened. As Abraham was falling asleep that night, he thought of Hannibal and his elephants and the high snowy mountains and how he never gave up. "I won't give up hope, Lahia, I promise. If I want to be free badly enough, I will manage it. I will be free." But the days of waiting for a master were difficult. More slaves came in every day, and every day slaves were sold, and every day customers came, but no one bought Abraham. Then on the 10th day, a middle-aged Turk, short and stocky and weather-beaten, and with work-stained hands, came in with half a dozen guards and a couple of white officials in gorgeous robes and tall hats. They picked out Abraham, along with 5 other bigger black boys, felt their muscles and looked in their mouths and eyes, discussing all the while in their own language. At last they paid the slave market merchant, after a lot of bargaining, took all 6 of the black boys and led them out along steep, narrow lanes, the guards beating the crowds out of the way with their fierce long whips, past 2 especially enormous mosques, and in through the biggest gatehouse Abraham had ever seen, into a huge courtyard where the first thing he saw was a heap of human heads, their warm blood still steaming as it trickled down to soak into the grass. That's the end of chapter 5.